Welcome to DiscoveRy. I am your host, Ryan Lindbergh, and today we will be talking about correlation versus causation. We will be defining both and talking about why it is important to understand the difference between the two. Correlation is very easy to observe frequently, and causation, as we'll see, can be a little bit tricky to observe. And when we're looking specifically at how government policy affects individuals, it's important to be able to find these causal relationships so that we can understand how certain policies affect people and how the government should act accordingly. We will be talking about how researchers are able to conduct very creative and strategic strategies in order to find these causal relationships, which can be tricky to find. Before we begin, here's a quote from Benjamin Franklin: "An investment in knowledge pays the best interest." Think on that for a second. All right, so we are going to go into correlation. So correlation between two variables is basically when you can make the sentence, when variable X increases, Y tends to increase or decrease. So we will be focusing on a linear relationship just because that's the most simple and most common form of correlation. Here we see height on the x-axis and weight on the y-axis. So although it's not perfect, we see that as height tends to increase, as height increases, weight tends to increase, which makes sense. But as we can see, it isn't exactly perfect, but we see we're able to draw this line to best fit the data, and it has a positive slope. We could also see variables that are negatively correlated, and those would have a negative slope for the line of best fit. Just to compare, here are two variables which do not seem to be correlated with each other. We see height on the x-axis and average exam score on the y-axis. So it doesn't seem like people's height is correlated with how well they do on an exam. So knowing how tall someone is wouldn't necessarily allow us to guess how well they did on the exam compared to other people, which does make sense. Now we will look at causation. And basically that means that we could say that an increase in X causes Y to increase or decrease. So a basic straightforward relationship here is rain causes the floor to get wet. It can be as simple as that. So just simply that one causes the other to happen. Seems pretty simple, but the main point of this presentation is that correlation does not imply causation. Just because there's two variables where you can draw a line where one increases when the other tends to increase, doesn't mean that one variable is causing the other. So just as a kind of humorous, funny visual, we see that there's two variables here. The letters in winning word of Scripps National Spelling Bee is correlated with the number of people killed by venomous spiders. They have a correlation of 80%. And we see that these lines kind of move together a little bit. But with these two variables, it would be very surprising if one of these caused the other. They likely are unrelated with each other. They just see that they have been moving in the same directions recently. Also, one more example, we see that the divorce rate in Maine, which is the red line, correlates with the per capita consumption of margarine. We see that both lines have been going down and have similar shapes, and they have a correlation of over 99%, which is, it seems pretty significant. But again, we would be surprised if these two variables were related to each other in any way, much less if one causing the other. That would be very shocking. So one more example here is we have the claim that firefighters cause more damage to a building during a fire. Someone might have observed that when more firefighters show up to a fire, at the end result is more damage to the building. So if that's true, then we should send less firefighters to a fire. This is obviously not what we should do, but let's look into this a bit more. We see that the seriousness of the fire is something that is not being observed here. Here it's called a lurking variable. We can also call it a confounding variable, but it's something in the background that we're not looking at that can cause a relationship that we would observe here. So here we observed that the number of firefighters going up made the amount of damage to the building go up, but there's no causal relationship here. If there is a causal relationship, it would be that firefighters make the damage to the building go down, which would be the intuitive conclusion. But we see that the seriousness of the fire is in the background, causing both of these to increase. So that is pretty significant to understand, because if we assume that the claim was true because both of these went up at the same time, maybe we would send less firefighters to go stop a fire, which would obviously be very problematic, as they are the ones that are putting out the fire. So it is important to understand that even though there's this correlation right here, the causation could be in the background. And so it's important to be able to distinguish between the two. So how researchers in society are able to distinguish between the two are with randomized controlled trials. So if you're able to get two groups of people and split them, or get one group of people and split them randomly into two groups, then you apply one treatment to one and another treatment to the other. One is often the control group. Then you can see how just that treatment was able to affect the individuals, because you assume that if the group is large enough, randomizing them into two groups accounts for all other variables that might exist and might have a causal effect. So this is very common in vaccine trials today, where researchers randomly split people into two groups, give one the vaccine, one the placebo, and then people don't even know which one they have, and they can see exactly the effectiveness of the vaccine. So in the same way, we'll see how government policies, it's not as straightforward as giving a placebo to some people, but we want to understand how government policies affect people. So we'll see how researchers are able to be creative in order to get this randomization. Correlation versus causation is very key to answering the nature versus nurture debate. So it is easy to observe that across the income bracket, we see that poor families are more likely to have babies that were exposed to tobacco while they were in the womb than richer families. So is this due to the families being poor? Is that just something based off of income inequality? Or are there more variables behind the scenes that can play into that? And knowing what the actual causal relationship is key to understanding how we can best fight the problem. One way that researchers are able to maybe find this, find causation here is with adopted children studies, not specifically with that example, but when children are at the same time sent out to families, they might be distributed all across the income bracket, but we assume that if they're randomly distributed, that characteristics of them will, of their DNA, of their genetics, will not have an impact. So then we can see how specifically the treatment of how rich they are growing up affects their outcome in certain ways. Another way that researchers are able to get creative with finding randomization is with a cutoff window. So one cutoff window that we see is the introduction of Easy Pass in a famous study done by Professor Curry. And they found that after Easy Pass was introduced, the babies before that were born after had better health than the babies that were born before. And this is how they were able to find that maybe the emissions of the cars that were stopping at the toll were causing the mothers to breathe it and the baby to come out less healthy. So this is huge in understanding, because it shows that maybe the government should subsidize certain policies that allow for better air quality, or for families to be able to not live near a toll booth when it is affecting the health of their child. And we also know the health of that child when they're even in the womb can have a big impact on how the rest of their life turns out. And so this was a huge study done, and it is key to understanding what policies need to come into effect to best ensure the health of people. So with that, understanding societal inequality, we see that even across the income bracket, there's inequalities, and some of these can be causal with growing up poor and not having enough money to afford certain cares, or it also could be the intergenerational transmission of health and how certain genetics predispose people to certain outcomes. So if policy was directed towards this inequality, it would be important to understand specifically how the causal relationship, what the causal relationship is, so people even know what they're fighting. And it's also important to understand how certain policies affect individuals. So another example is a study where at a cutoff date, or before I get into the cutoff window, the government wanted to encourage dads to become involved in their child's life at an early age, or to take paternity leave, but they saw that not many fathers were taking paternity leave. So at a cutoff window, all the dads of babies born afterwards were able to take paternity leave, while the ones before did not have a free month of paternity leave. So they found that with the dads after the paternity leave, they were more likely to take paternity leave if they had a coworker or a family member that also qualified. So this is huge in understanding that the participation in a government program can be affected by social interactions. And finally, this shows us that we need to be constantly paying attention to patterns in the world and what's happening around us, in order to be able to find those causal relationships. Even there was a study done in Zambia where maternal mortality information was given randomized to either the father or the mother. And they found that when it was given to the father, they were able to arrive at more understanding and better communication between the couple than if it was given to the mother. So even with small things like this, it makes a big impact on people's lives, especially when we're focusing on how the government should best position itself and the policies that they should introduce and how they should carry out these programs. It is very important to understand how they're actually affecting people and all of the interactions and all the variables that arise due to a program. That was it for DiscoveRy. Always remember 2 steps forward, 1 step forward. We always want to be going forward. That's obvious. I hope you learned a little bit about correlation versus causation, and maybe how it's tricky to identify a causal relationship, and also why it's very important for government policy and in order to establish these causal relationships. So I hope you guys have a great day, and thank you for watching.